The Marconi mansion stood like a fortress against the night, its iron gates guarding secrets older than the city itself. Candlelight flickered through tall windows, casting dancing shadows across marble floors that had witnessed generations of blood oaths, whispered conspiracies and silent betrayals. Tonight the grand dining hall was alive with the low murmur of voices, the clink of crystal glasses, and the heavy scent of roasted meat and aged wine. Dante Marconi sat near the head of the long mahogany table, his tailored suit sharp against the velvet-backed chair. At 28, he carried himself with the arrogance of a man who had never known consequence. His dark hair was slicked back, his jaw strong, his eyes cold with the certainty that his last name was armor enough against any threat. He laughed too loudly at his own jokes, his wine-glass perpetually full, his attention drifting lazily across the faces of family and associates gathered for the monthly feast. To his left sat his grandfather, Don Salvatore Marconi, a man whose silence carried more weight than most men's shouting. The Don was in his 70s now, his face carved with the lines of 1,000 decisions, each one stained with blood or gold. His hands rested calmly on the table, rings glinting in the candlelight. He rarely spoke during these dinners, preferring to observe, to listen, to note who drank too much and who spoke too freely. Across from Dante, his father, Luca Marconi, the underboss, ate in measured bites, his expression unreadable. Luca had spent decades walking the thin line between loyalty to his father and his own quiet ambitions. He had learned long ago that power in this family was not given, it was endured. But at the far end of the table, almost hidden in the shadows cast by the tall candelabras, sat Donna Bianca Marconi. She was 72 years old, dressed in black as she had been every day since her husband, Don Salvatore's father, had been buried 30 years ago. Her silver hair was pulled back into a tight bun, her face pale and lined, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She spoke rarely, and when she did, her voice was soft, almost fragile. To most of the younger men at the table, she was invisible, a relic, a widow who had outlived her usefulness. Dante had never given her much thought. She was his grandmother by blood, but in his mind she was nothing more than a ghost, haunting the edges of family gatherings. He had been told once years ago that she had been important in the old days, that she had advised his great-grandfather during the wars with the Irish and the Russians, but that was ancient history. This was his time now. The meal progressed in the usual rhythm. Capos spoke in low tones about territory disputes, about shipments and payments, about soldiers who needed to be reminded of their place. A consigliere named Enzo, a thin man with spectacles and a voice like silk, leaned close to Don Salvatore, whispering something that made the old man nod slowly. At the opposite end, enforcers and soldiers ate with the quiet intensity of men who knew their presence was tolerated, not celebrated. Dante reached for the wine bottle, pouring himself another glass. He was halfway through it when Donna Bianca's voice cut softly through the noise. "Dante." He paused, the glass halfway to his lips. He looked down the table toward her, his expression briefly annoyed. "Yes, Nonna," he said, his tone flat, bored. "You should slow down with the wine," she said gently. "It is disrespectful to drink so much at a family table. Your great-grandfather never allowed it." The room did not fall silent, not quite, but several conversations faltered. A few eyes flicked toward Dante, then away. Luca Marconi set down his fork slowly, his gaze steady on his son. Don Salvatore did not move, but his eyes shifted just slightly toward his mother. Dante stared at Donna Bianca for a long moment. Then he smiled. It was a cold, mocking smile. "Disrespectful?" he repeated, his voice rising just enough to draw more attention. "Nonna, with all respect, no one cares what my great-grandfather allowed. He's been dead longer than I've been alive." A ripple of unease passed through the room. One of the capos coughed quietly. Another shifted in his seat. Luca Marconi's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Donna Bianca's expression did not change. Her hands remained folded, her voice calm. "Tradition is not dead simply because the man who upheld it has passed," she said. "This family exists because of tradition, because of respect. You would do well to remember that." Dante's smile vanished. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "You know what, Nonna?" he said, his voice hardening. "I'm tired of hearing about the old ways, the old rules, the old men. This family survived because we adapted, because we stopped living in the past." He picked up his wineglass and drained it in one long swallow, his eyes locked on hers. Then, slowly, deliberately, He reached for the bottle again and poured another glass. The red liquid splashed into the crystal, filling it to the brim. "Maybe you should stop living in the past too," he said. Donna Bianca did not flinch. Her pale eyes remained steady on his face. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint crackle of candles and the distant hum of the city beyond the gates. Then she spoke again, her voice quieter now, almost sorrowful. "I only ask that you honor the memory of those who built this family, Dante. That is not living in the past. That is gratitude." Dante's face flushed. Whether from the wine or from anger, it was hard to say. He set the bottle down hard, the glass clinking sharply against the wood. "Gratitude?" he said, his voice rising. "Do you want gratitude? I'll tell you what I'm grateful for, Nonna. I'm grateful I don't have to sit in a corner like some forgotten relic, pretending I still matter." Gasps, quiet, almost inaudible, escaped from a few of the women seated farther down the table. One of the soldiers stopped chewing. Luca Marconi's eyes closed briefly, as if bracing for what was coming. Don Salvatore finally moved. He turned his head slowly toward his grandson, his expression unreadable, his silence heavy as stone. But Dante was not finished. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He picked up his wineglass and walked toward Donna Bianca, his footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet. The entire table watched him, frozen, uncertain. When he reached her, he stood over her, looking down at the small, frail woman dressed in black. "You want to lecture me about respect?" he said, his voice low and venomous. "You want to tell me what I should and shouldn't do?" Donna Bianca looked up at him, her face expressionless, her hands still folded in her lap. "I only wish to remind you of who you are," she said softly. Dante's lip curled. He tilted his glass, and in one swift motion, he poured the wine over her head. The red liquid splashed across her silver hair, ran down her pale face and stained the black fabric of her dress. She did not move. She did not gasp. She simply sat there, her eyes still locked on his, as the wine dripped onto the floor. The room exploded into chaos. Luca Marconi shot to his feet, his face white with rage. Several capos stood, their voices rising in shock and anger. One of the consiglieres hissed a curse under his breath. Women covered their mouths, their eyes wide with horror. But Don Salvatore did not move. He sat perfectly still, his gaze fixed on his grandson, his expression carved from ice. Dante stepped back, his breathing heavy, his hand still gripping the empty glass. For a moment he looked almost surprised by what he had done, as if the weight of it had only just settled on him. But then he straightened, his jaw set, his pride refusing to let him retreat. "Now you know how much your lectures are worth," he said coldly. Donna Bianca slowly raised one hand and wiped the wine from her face. Her fingers came away stained red. She looked at them for a long moment, then looked back at Dante. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely a whisper. "You will regret this, Dante." He laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "Will I?" he said. "What are you going to do, Nonna? Tell me another story about the old days." He turned and walked back to his seat, tossing the glass onto the table. It rolled across the wood and stopped just short of falling. No one moved to catch it. Luca Marconi was the first to break the silence. He turned to his son, his voice low and shaking with fury. "Get out," he said. Dante looked at him, his expression defiant. "What? Get out." Luca's voice was hard as iron now. "Leave this table. Leave this house now." Dante opened his mouth to argue, but something in his father's eyes made him stop. He glanced at Don Salvatore, but the old man's gaze was no longer on him. It was on Donna Bianca, who sat perfectly still, the wine still dripping from her hair, her face expressionless. Dante grabbed his jacket from the back of his chair and walked toward the door. His footsteps echoed through the hall, loud and defiant, until the heavy door slammed shut behind him. For a long moment no one spoke. Then Donna Bianca rose slowly to her feet. Wine dripped from her dress, pooling on the floor beneath her. She did not look at anyone. She simply turned and walked toward the shadows at the far end of the hall, her steps slow and deliberate. Don Salvatore watched her go, his face unreadable. When she disappeared through the archway, he finally spoke, his voice low and cold. "Enzo." The consigliere appeared at his side instantly, his expression tense. "Yes, Don Salvatore? Find out where my mother is going," the Don said quietly, "and tell me everything she does." Enzo nodded and vanished into the shadows. Luca Marconi sat down heavily, his hands shaking. He poured himself a glass of wine and drank it in one swallow, his eyes distant. Across the table, the capos exchanged glances. They had all heard the stories about Donna Bianca, about the wars she had orchestrated from the shadows, about the men who had crossed her and vanished without a trace. They had thought those stories were myths. Now they were not so sure. And in the darkness beyond the mansion, Donna Bianca walked alone through the gardens, her dress stained red, her face pale and calm. She did not cry. She did not rage. She simply remembered, and she began to plan. 3 days passed after the feast, 3 days in which Dante Marconi convinced himself that nothing would come of his outburst. He had humiliated an old woman, his grandmother, yes, but she was powerless. A widow with no soldiers, no territory, no voice in the family's operations. What could she possibly do? He spent those days as he always had, drinking in upscale clubs, gambling in backroom card games, and reminding anyone who would listen that he was a Marconi. His name opened doors, his grandfather's reputation kept them open, and his own arrogance made him believe he was untouchable. On the 4th day, things began to change. It started small, a phone call that went unanswered, a meeting that was abruptly cancelled. Dante had been scheduled to meet with Carlo Messina, a capo who controlled the docks on the east side. It was routine business, collecting payments, discussing shipments, reminding the workers who they answered to. But when Dante arrived at the warehouse, flanked by 2 soldiers, Carlo was not there. One of the dock workers, a grizzled man with a face like leather, shrugged when Dante demanded to know where the capo was. He said he had other business, the man muttered, not meeting Dante's eyes. Other business? Dante's voice rose. I'm standing right here. What other business is more important than me? The dock worker said nothing. He simply turned and walked away, his boots echoing on the concrete. Dante stood there, his jaw clenched, his hands balled into fists. The 2 soldiers with him exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. After a long moment, Dante turned and stormed back to his car, slamming the door hard enough to make the frame shudder. He told himself it was nothing. Carlo was probably dealing with something urgent. A shipment delay, a problem with the union. It happened, but the next day, it happened again. This time, it was Antonio Rizzo, a trusted enforcer who had worked for the Marconi family for over a decade. Dante had called him to arrange a collection from a restaurant owner who had been late on his payments. Antonio had always been reliable, brutal when necessary, efficient always. But when Dante called, Antonio did not answer. Dante tried again and again. Finally, on the 4th call, Antonio picked up. Yeah? His voice was flat, distant. Where the hell have you been? Dante snapped. I've been calling you all morning. There was a pause on the other end. Then Antonio spoke, his tone careful. I've been busy. Busy? Dante's voice dripped with disbelief. Busy with what? I need you to handle something tonight. Another pause. Longer this time. I can't tonight, Antonio said. Dante felt his blood pressure spike. What do you mean you can't? Since when do you turn down work? Since now, Antonio said quietly. I've got other orders. Other orders? Dante's voice was shaking now. From who? Antonio did not answer. The line went dead. Dante stared at the phone in his hand, his mind racing. Other orders. From who? His father? His grandfather? He tried calling Antonio again, but the enforcer did not pick up. That night Dante went to one of his usual haunts, a private club in the heart of the city, where men with money and blood on their hands gathered to play cards, drink expensive whiskey, and pretend they were legitimate. He needed to blow off steam, to remind himself that he was still Dante Marconi, still someone who mattered. But when he arrived, the doorman hesitated. Mr. Marconi, the man said, his voice nervous. I'm sorry, but the club is full tonight. Dante stared at him. Full? He repeated slowly. This place is never full, and even if it was, you know who I am. The doorman shifted uncomfortably. I understand, sir, but what? Dante stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Are you telling me I can't come in? The doorman swallowed hard. He glanced over his shoulder, then back at Dante. I'm just following orders, Mr. Marconi. Whose orders? The doorman said nothing. He simply stepped back and closed the door. Dante stood on the sidewalk, his hands trembling with rage and confusion. He looked around, half expecting to see someone watching him, laughing at him, but the street was empty except for a few passing cars and the distant glow of neon signs. He pulled out his phone and called his father. Luca Marconi answered on the second ring. What is it, Dante? What the hell is going on? Dante demanded. Carlo stood me up. Antonio won't take my calls. I just got turned away from the club. Is this some kind of joke? There was a long silence on the other end. Then Luca spoke, his voice cold and controlled. It's not a joke. Dante felt his stomach tighten. Then what is it? Did I do something? Is this about the other night? You humiliated your grandmother in front of the entire family, Luca said quietly. What did you think was going to happen? She's an old woman, Dante shouted into the phone. She doesn't run anything. She has no power. Luca laughed, a short, bitter sound. You don't know anything, do you? He said. You think power is about soldiers and guns and territory. You think it's about who shouts the loudest. Then what is it? Dante demanded. It's about loyalty, Luca said. It's about respect. It's about knowing who really holds the strings. What are you talking about? Luca sighed, and for a moment he sounded almost tired. Your grandmother is not just some widow, Dante. She never was. She was the consigliere to your great-grandfather. She advised him during the bloodiest years this family has ever seen. She brokered peace with the Russians. She orchestrated the fall of the De Luca family. She knows things, secrets, debts, alliances, that no one else knows. And the men who remember those days? They still answer to her. Dante felt the ground shift beneath him. That's impossible, he whispered. Is it? Luca's voice was hard now. Then explain why Carlo Messina didn't show up. Explain why Antonio Rizzo ignored your calls. Explain why you just got turned away from a club that your grandfather owns. Dante said nothing. His mind was spinning, trying to piece together something that made sense. She's making a point, Luca continued. She's reminding you and everyone else that you are not untouchable, that you are not above tradition. And if you keep pushing, she will do more than embarrass you. What else can she do? Dante asked, his voice barely audible. Luca was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost a whisper. You don't want to find out. The line went dead. Dante stood alone on the street, the phone still pressed to his ear, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. He looked up at the dark windows of the buildings around him, at the shadows pooling in the alleys, at the distant hum of the city that suddenly felt hostile and cold. For the first time in his life, Dante Marconi felt afraid. Meanwhile, across the city, in a small apartment above an old bakery, Donna Bianca sat at a wooden table, a single candle burning beside her. In front of her was a leather-bound ledger, its pages yellowed with age. She ran her fingers across the names written there, names of men who owed the Marconi family debts, men who had sworn oaths, men who remembered the old wars and the old ways. Beside the ledger was a rotary phone, black and heavy, its cord coiled like a serpent. She lifted the receiver and dialed a number from memory. The phone rang twice before a gruff voice answered. Pronto. Vittorio, Donna Bianca said softly. It has been a long time. There was a pause. Then the voice on the other end shifted, becoming quieter, more respectful. Donna Bianca, I thought you had retired. I had, she said, but it seems my grandson needs to be reminded of certain truths. Vittorio chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. The boy who threw wine on you at the feast? Yes, I heard about that. Word travels fast. It always does, Donna Bianca said. I need a favor, Vittorio. Anything. I need you to speak to your men. Tell them that Dante Marconi is no longer to be trusted with family business, not until I say otherwise. There was a brief silence. Then Vittorio spoke, his voice careful. That is a dangerous thing to do, Donna. His grandfather knows. Donna Bianca interrupted. He has given me permission to handle this as I see fit. Vittorio exhaled slowly. Then it will be done. Thank you, Vittorio. One question, Donna. Yes? How far do you intend to take this? Donna Bianca looked at the candle flame, watching it flicker and dance in the darkness. As far as necessary, she said quietly. She hung up the phone and turned to the next page of the ledger. There were more names, more debts, more men who remembered. She picked up a pen and began to write. Across the city, Dante Marconi lay awake in his expensive apartment, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. He thought about his father's words, about the men who had ignored him, about the grandmother he had dismissed as irrelevant. And for the first time he wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. Outside his window the city hummed with life, cars honking, voices shouting, music drifting from open windows. But to Dante it all sounded distant, muffled, as if he were already being erased. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but sleep would not come, because somewhere in the darkness Donna Bianca was still awake, and she was not finished. By the end of the first week, Dante's world had begun to fracture in ways he could not comprehend. It was not a collapse marked by violence or dramatic confrontation. It was quieter than that, more insidious. Like a building whose foundation had been slowly eroded until one day, without warning, the walls began to crack. The soldiers who used to nod respectfully when he passed now looked through him as if he were invisible. The restaurant owners who once rushed to greet him with free drinks and the best table now claimed they were fully booked. The card games he had been invited to for years suddenly had no open seats. Even his own crew, the men his father had assigned to him, seemed distracted, evasive, always claiming they had other orders to follow. Dante tried to ignore it at first. He told himself it was temporary, that his grandmother's influence was overstated, that the old guard would eventually lose interest and things would return to normal. But with each passing day, the isolation grew tighter, more suffocating. He decided to confront his father. He drove to the Marconi estate on a grey afternoon, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened rain but never delivered. The gates opened slowly, as they always had, but there was something different in the way the guards looked at him, not with hostility exactly, more like pity. He found his father in the study, a wood-panelled room filled with leather-bound books and the faint smell of cigar smoke. Luca Marconi sat behind a heavy oak desk, reviewing a stack of papers, his reading glasses perched on his nose. He did not look up when Dante entered. "We need to talk," Dante said, his voice tight. Luca set down his pen and removed his glasses, folding them carefully before meeting his son's gaze. "Sit," he said. Dante remained standing. "I'm not here to sit. I'm here to find out what the hell is going on. No one will work with me. No one will talk to me. I'm being shut out of everything." Luca leaned back in his chair, his expression calm, almost serene. "And whose fault is that?" "Don't start with me," Dante snapped. "This is insane. She's one old woman. How does she have this much control?" Luca studied his son for a long moment, then gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit," he repeated, his voice harder this time. Dante hesitated, then reluctantly dropped into the chair, his jaw clenched. Luca folded his hands on the desk and spoke slowly, deliberately. "You think power comes from being loud, from being feared, from throwing your weight around and demanding respect. But that's not how this family works. That's not how it has ever worked." "Then how does it work?" Dante demanded. "Through memory," Luca said. "Through loyalty earned over decades. Through favors owed and debts collected. Through knowing who owes what to whom and when to call in those debts." He leaned forward, his eyes hard. "Your grandmother has been collecting those debts for 50 years. She knows things about this family, about the men who work for us, the alliances we've made, the enemies we've destroyed, that even I don't know. She was there when your great-grandfather went to war with the Irish. She brokered the truce with the Russians that kept this family alive. She orchestrated the fall of the De Luca syndicate without firing a single shot." Dante shook his head, unwilling to believe it. "If she's so powerful, why does she live in silence? Why does she sit in the corner at family dinners and say nothing?" "Because she doesn't need to speak," Luca said. "Her power doesn't come from being seen, it comes from being remembered. And the men who matter, the capos, the consiglières, the soldiers who have been with this family for decades, they remember." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "You humiliated her in front of those men. You poured wine on her head and laughed about it, and in doing so you insulted every single person at that table who respects her. You showed them that you have no understanding of loyalty, no respect for tradition, and no appreciation for the sacrifices that built this family." Dante felt his face flush with anger. "So what? I'm supposed to apologize, beg for forgiveness." "That would be a start," Luca said coldly, "but I don't think it will be enough, not anymore." "What does that mean?" Luca stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. He stared out at the gardens, where the first drops of rain had begun to fall. "It means your grandmother is not interested in apologies. She's interested in lessons, and she's going to make sure you learn this one." Dante surged to his feet, his voice rising. "This is ridiculous. She's punishing me like I'm a child. I'm a grown man. I'm a Marconi." Luca turned to face him, and for the first time, Dante saw something in his father's eyes that made him stop. It was not anger. It was not disappointment. It was something colder, something final. "You're a Marconi by blood," Luca said quietly. "But blood is not enough. It never has been. You have to earn the name, and right now, you haven't earned anything." Dante stared at his father, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He wanted to argue, to shout, to demand that someone fix this, but the words died in his throat. He turned and walked out of the study, his footsteps echoing through the empty halls. That night, Dante sat alone in his apartment, a bottle of whiskey on the table in front of him. He poured a glass and drank it in one swallow, then poured another. The rain beat against the windows, a steady, relentless rhythm that matched the pounding in his head. He thought about calling someone, anyone, but he didn't know who would answer. His friends had stopped returning his texts. His contacts in the family had gone silent. Even the women he used to see had suddenly become unavailable. He was being erased, slowly, methodically, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. A knock at the door made him jump. He set down the glass and walked to the door, peering through the peephole. Standing in the hallway was a man he recognized, Marco della Rosa, a soldier who had worked with Dante on a few collections over the past year. He was young, competent, and loyal, or so Dante had thought. Dante opened the door. "Marco," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "What are you doing here?" Marco looked uncomfortable. He glanced down the hallway, then back at Dante. "Can I come in?" Dante stepped aside and Marco entered, his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets. He looked around the apartment, taking in the half-empty bottle, the scattered papers, the general air of disarray. "What's going on?" Dante asked, closing the door. Marco hesitated, then spoke quietly. "I came to give you a warning." Dante felt his stomach tighten. "A warning about what?" "About your grandmother," Marco said. "She's not just freezing you out. She's building a case against you." "A case?" Dante repeated, his voice rising. "What kind of case?" Marco looked at him, his expression grim. "She's been talking to people, asking questions about the jobs you've done, the money you've handled, the deals you've made. She's looking for mistakes, for anything that can be used to prove you're not fit to carry the Marconi name." Dante felt the room tilt. "That's insane. I haven't done anything wrong." Marco raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure about that?" Dante opened his mouth to answer, then stopped. His mind raced back over the past few years, the collections that had come up short, the deals that had fallen through, the money he had borrowed from family accounts and never repaid. He had always told himself it was fine, that he would settle things eventually, that no one was keeping track, but someone had been keeping track. "She's been talking to the accountants," Marco continued, "to the capos you've worked with, to the soldiers who've run jobs for you, and what she's finding, it's not good, Dante." Dante sank into a chair, his hands trembling. "Why are you telling me this?" Marco shrugged. "Because I owe you. You gave me a chance when no one else would. But after this, we're even. I can't be seen helping you. Not if I want to keep working." He walked to the door, then paused and looked back. "My advice? Fix this. Apologize. Beg if you have to. Because if you don't, she's going to destroy you. And no one, not your father, not your grandfather, is going to stop her." He left, closing the door softly behind him. Dante sat alone in the dark, the rain still falling outside, the whiskey still sitting on the table. He thought about his grandmother, the quiet, fragile woman he had dismissed as irrelevant, the woman he had humiliated without a second thought. And he realized with a cold, creeping certainty that he had made the worst mistake of his life. Across the city, in her small apartment, Donna Bianca sat at her table, the ledger open in front of her. She had made calls. She had asked questions. She had listened to stories and collected testimonies, and now she had what she needed. She closed the ledger and folded her hands, her face calm, her eyes distant. The rain fell harder now, drumming against the windows, washing the streets clean, and in the darkness Donna Bianca smiled. 2 weeks after the feast, Dante received a summons, not a phone call, not a text, a handwritten note delivered by a courier who refused to look him in the eye. The paper was heavy, cream-colored, and bore no signature, only a single line in elegant script. "You are expected at the estate, Sunday evening. Do not be late." Dante stared at the note, his hands shaking. He knew what this meant. A family meeting, a formal gathering, the kind where decisions were made and judgments passed. He had attended dozens of them over the years, always as an observer, always secure in the knowledge that he was protected by his name, his bloodline, his place in the hierarchy. But this time was different. This time he was not an observer. He was the accused. Sunday arrived cold and grey, the sky heavy with the promise of winter. Dante dressed carefully, choosing a dark suit, a crisp white shirt, and a tie that his father had once told him made him look serious. He stared at himself in the mirror, searching for confidence, for the arrogance that had always come so easily. But all he saw was a man who looked tired, uncertain and afraid. He drove to the estate slowly, taking the long way, as if delaying the inevitable would somehow change the outcome. The gates opened without a word from the guards, and he parked in the circular driveway, his car dwarfed by the towering columns of the mansion. The front door was already open, a silent invitation, or perhaps a command. Inside, the air was thick with tension. The usual warmth of the estate, the soft lighting, the smell of cooking, the distant murmur of conversation, was absent. Instead, the halls were silent, the lights dimmed, the atmosphere heavy as a funeral. He was led by a young soldier to the library, a room he had rarely entered. It was a place reserved for serious matters, for discussions that required privacy and gravity. The walls were lined with shelves of old books, their spines cracked and faded. A long table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by high-backed chairs, and seated at that table were the men who mattered. Don Salvatore Marconi sat at the head, his hands folded, his expression carved from stone. To his right was Luca Marconi, Dante's father, his face pale and drawn. Beside him was Enzo, the consigliere, his spectacles glinting in the low light, his pen poised over a leather notebook. Across the table were three capos, Carlo Messina, Vittorio Russo, and Giovanni Falcone, men who controlled entire territories, who commanded soldiers, who had survived wars and betrayals, and the slow, grinding passage of time. And at the far end of the table, seated in shadow, was Donna Bianca. She wore black as always, her silver hair pulled back, her hands folded in her lap. She did not look at Dante when he entered. She simply sat there, still as a statue, her presence filling the room like smoke. Dante stood in the doorway, his heart pounding, his mouth dry. No one spoke. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, until finally Don Salvatore raised one hand and gestured to an empty chair across from him. "Sit," he said. Dante walked to the chair and sat, his movements stiff, mechanical. He could feel every pair of eyes on him, could sense the weight of judgment pressing down on his shoulders. Don Salvatore leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Do you know why you are here?" Dante swallowed hard. "I can guess." "Then guess," the Don said coldly. Dante glanced at his father, but Luca did not meet his eyes. He looked at the capos, but they stared back with expressions of stone. Finally he looked at his grandmother, but she remained motionless, her face hidden in shadow. "I'm here because of what happened at the feast," Dante said quietly, "because I disrespected my grandmother." "Disrespected?" Don Salvatore repeated, his voice flat. "Is that what you call it?" Dante said nothing. The Don leaned back, his fingers drumming slowly on the table. "You did not just disrespect your grandmother, Dante. You insulted the memory of my father. You insulted every man at that table who has given his life to this family. You insulted the very foundation of what we are." He paused, letting the words sink in. "But that is not why you are here." Dante felt his stomach twist. "Then why am I here?" Don Salvatore looked at Enzo, who opened his notebook and began to read in a calm, measured voice. "Over the past 3 years, you have been entrusted with several responsibilities within the family: collections, negotiations, oversight of certain operations. In that time, you have mishandled funds totaling over $200,000. Dante's mouth went dry. "That's not—" "You took money from family accounts without authorization," Enzo continued, his tone unaffected. "You failed to collect debts owed to us, allowing certain individuals to default without consequence. You borrowed from our reserves to cover your gambling losses and never repaid what you took." "I was going to pay it back," Dante said weakly. Enzo looked up from the notebook, his eyes cold. "When?" Dante had no answer. Enzo turned a page and continued. "You were given command of a crew last year. In that time, 2 of your soldiers were arrested because of your negligence. One of them talked to the police. He is now in witness protection because you failed to ensure his loyalty." "That wasn't my fault," Dante protested. "He was weak. He was always going to talk." "You chose him," Vittorio Russo said, his voice like gravel. "You vouched for him. His failure is your failure." Dante opened his mouth to argue, but Carlo Messina cut him off. "You missed 3 meetings with me in the past month," Carlo said. "Meetings that were critical to operations at the docks. Because you missed those meetings, shipments were delayed, money was lost, and our reputation suffered." "I had other things to deal with," Dante said desperately. "Other things?" Giovanni Falcone repeated, his voice dripping with contempt. "Like drinking, like gambling, like sleeping with the wives of men who work for us." Dante felt the blood drain from his face. "We know everything, Dante," Don Salvatore said quietly. "Your grandmother made sure of that." All eyes turned to Donna Bianca. She had not moved, she had not spoken, But now, slowly, she leaned forward into the light, her pale face emerging from the shadows. Her eyes, when they met Dante's, were calm, almost gentle. "I did not want to do this," she said softly. "I hoped that you would learn, that you would grow, that you would become worthy of the name you carry." Her voice was quiet, but it filled the room. "But you did not learn. You took everything for granted. You believed that your blood was enough, that your name would protect you from consequence." She folded her hands on the table. "So I did what I have always done. I asked questions. I listened. I remembered. And I discovered that you are not just arrogant, Dante. You are careless, reckless, a liability." Dante felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. "I can fix this," he said, his voice breaking. "I can make it right. Just give me a chance." Donna Bianca shook her head slowly. "You had your chance. You had many chances, and you squandered every one of them." Don Salvatore raised a hand, and the room fell silent again. He looked at Dante for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You are my grandson," he said finally, "and for that reason I will not have you killed. I will not have you disappeared. But you are no longer fit to carry the Marconi name in any official capacity." Dante felt the world tilt. "What does that mean?" "It means you are out," Luca Marconi said, his voice hollow. "You are no longer part of the family business. You will receive no money, no protection, no support. You are on your own. You can't do this," Dante whispered. "We already have," Don Salvatore said coldly. He stood, and the others stood with him. One by one, they walked past Dante without looking at him, their footsteps echoing through the library. Luca paused for a moment beside his son, as if he wanted to say something, but then he shook his head and continued on. Soon, only Donna Bianca remained. She stood slowly, her movements careful, deliberate. She walked around the table and stopped in front of Dante, looking down at him with those calm, ancient eyes. "I told you that you would regret what you did," she said softly. "I told you at the feast. You did not listen." Dante looked up at her, his face wet with tears. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." Donna Bianca tilted her head, studying him. "I believe you are," she said. "But sorrow is not enough. Regret is not enough. You must earn your way back, and that will take time. Perhaps years, perhaps a lifetime." She turned and walked toward the door, her footsteps barely audible on the thick carpet. Before she left, she paused and looked back at him one last time. "Goodbye, Dante," she said, and then she was gone. Dante sat alone in the library, the silence pressing down on him like a weight. He had no family, no money, no name. He had been erased, just as his father had warned him. Not with violence, not with bloodshed, but with something far more devastating, with silence. Outside, the rain began to fall again, drumming against the windows, washing the world clean. And in the shadows of the mansion, Donna Bianca walked slowly through the halls, her face calm, her heart steady. She had done what needed to be done, and now she could rest. 6 months passed like a slow death. Dante Marconi, once a prince of the underworld, now lived in a cramped studio apartment in a neighborhood where no one knew his name, and no one cared. The money he had saved ran out within the first 2 months. His expensive car was repossessed. His designer suits gathered dust in a closet he could no longer afford to keep. He took a job washing dishes at a restaurant on the edge of the city, working 14-hour shifts for barely enough to cover rent and food. No one from the family contacted him. Not his father, not his grandfather, not even the soldiers he had once commanded. It was as if he had never existed, as if his name had been scrubbed from every ledger, every memory, every whispered conversation in dark rooms. He was a ghost. At first, the anger sustained him. He blamed his grandmother, his father, the capos who had turned their backs on him. He blamed the system, the tradition, the old ways that had crushed him for one mistake. But as the weeks turned into months, the anger faded, replaced by something deeper, more painful, shame. He began to understand slowly what he had lost. Not just his position, his money, his status. He had lost something far more precious, the trust of men who had built their lives on loyalty, on sacrifice, on the quiet understanding that the family came before everything else, and he had thrown it all away in a moment of drunken arrogance. One evening, as he scrubbed grease from pots in the back of the restaurant, his hands raw and aching, he thought about the feast, about the way his grandmother had looked at him when the wine dripped from her face, about the silence that had followed, about the way the men at the table had turned away, one by one, their respect for him evaporating like smoke. He realized, with a clarity that made his chest ache, that she had not destroyed him out of cruelty. She had destroyed him out of mercy. She had given him the one thing he had never been given before, a consequence. That night, he sat alone in his apartment, the television flickering in the corner, and he made a decision. He would not beg for forgiveness. He would not grovel or plead or demand to be let back in. He would do something far harder. He would earn it. The next morning, he walked into a community center in one of the poorest neighborhoods in the city and asked if they needed help. The director, a tired woman in her 50s, looked him up and down with suspicion. "What kind of help?" she asked. "Any kind," Dante said. "I can clean, I can organize, I can teach kids if you need it. I just want to do something useful." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "We need someone to help with the after-school program. Kids need tutoring, mentoring, someone to keep them out of trouble. You think you can do that?" Dante hesitated. He had never worked with kids before. He had never worked with anyone who did not answer to violence or fear. "I can try," he said. She handed him a clipboard. "Fill this out. You start Monday." For the next 3 months, Dante worked at the community center every day after his dishwashing shift ended. He helped kids with their homework, taught them how to read, listened to their problems, and tried, in small ways, to give them the guidance he had never received. It was exhausting. It was humbling. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, it began to change him. He learned their names, their stories, the struggles they faced, poverty, violence, absent parents, a world that had already written them off, and he saw in their eyes the same arrogance, the same recklessness, the same belief that the world owed them something, that he had once carried. He tried to teach them what he had learned. That respect was earned, not demanded. That loyalty was a gift, not a right. That the choices they made today would define who they became tomorrow. And in teaching them, he began to believe it himself. One evening, as he locked up the community center, he saw a familiar car parked across the street, a black sedan, its windows tinted, its engine idling. His heart jumped into his throat. He knew that car. He knew what it meant. The back door opened, and a man stepped out. It was Enzo, the consigliere, his spectacles catching the light, his expression unreadable. "Dante," he said quietly. Dante walked toward him, his hands shaking, his mind racing. "Enzo," he said, "I didn't expect to see you." "Your grandmother sent me," Enzo said. Dante felt his stomach tighten. "Why?" Enzo gestured toward the community center. "She wanted to know what you have been doing, so I have been watching." Dante felt a flash of anger. "You've been spying on me?" "Not spying," Enzo said calmly. "Observing. There is a difference." He stepped closer, his voice lowering. "She wanted to know if you were wasting your life, if you were drowning in self-pity, if you had given up." "And what did you tell her?" Dante asked, his voice tight. Enzo looked at him for a long moment, then smiled, just slightly. "I told her that you were working, that you were trying, that you were doing something I have rarely seen a Marconi do." "What's that?" "Learning," Enzo said. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope, handing it to Dante. "She asked me to give you this." Dante took the envelope, his hands trembling. He opened it slowly and pulled out a single piece of paper. It was a handwritten note, the script elegant and precise. "Dante, I have watched you from a distance. I have seen your struggle. I have seen your choices. You are not yet ready to return, but you are no longer the boy who threw wine in my face. When you are ready, come to me, not to ask for forgiveness, not to beg for your place, but to show me that you understand what it means to be a Marconi. With respect, Donna Bianca." Dante stared at the note, his vision blurring with tears. He looked up at Enzo, his voice breaking. "Does this mean—" "It means nothing yet," Enzo said firmly. "It means she is willing to listen, but you must prove yourself, not just to her, to everyone." He turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing. Your father has been watching too. He will not admit it, but he is proud of what you are doing. Do not disappoint him again." Enzo climbed back into the car, and it pulled away, disappearing into the night. Dante stood on the sidewalk, the note clutched in his hand, the weight of 6 months lifting just slightly from his shoulders. He was not forgiven. He was not redeemed, but for the first time since the feast, he felt something he had not felt in a long time: hope. 2 years passed. Dante continued his work at the community center, expanding the program, raising funds, bringing in volunteers. He returned to school, earning a degree in social work. He rebuilt his life, one small decision at a time, one honest choice after another. and he did not ask to return to the family, but the family was watching. One evening, as he walked home from the center, he found another black sedan waiting. This time, it was his father who stepped out. Luca Marconi looked older, grayer, but his eyes were steady, his expression calm. "Dante," he said. "Dad," Dante replied, his voice uncertain. Luca walked toward him, his hands in his pockets. "Your grandmother wants to see you." Dante felt his heart pound. Now, now. They drove in silence to the estate, the familiar gates opening, the gardens lit softly by lanterns. Inside, the mansion was warm, filled with the smell of cooking, the distant sound of laughter. It felt like home. A home Dante had not been allowed to enter for 2 years. He was led to the library, the same room where he had been cast out, but this time, only 2 people were waiting. Don Salvatore sat at the head of the table, his face lined but his gaze sharp, and beside him, seated in her usual black dress, was Donna Bianca. Dante stood in the doorway, his throat tight, his hands trembling. "Come in," his grandmother said softly. He walked to the table and stood before them, his head bowed. "Sit," Don Salvatore said. Dante sat. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Donna Bianca leaned forward, her pale eyes studying him. "Tell me what you have learned," she said. Dante took a deep breath. "I learned that respect is not given because of blood. It is earned through actions. I learned that loyalty is not demanded. It is offered freely, and it must be honored. I learned that the family is not just about power or money or fear. It is about trust, about sacrifice, about carrying the weight of those who came before us and protecting those who will come after." He paused, his voice breaking. "And I learned that I was not worthy of this name, but I am trying to become worthy. Every day, in small ways, in ways that matter." Donna Bianca did not smile, but something softened in her eyes. "Do you understand why I did what I did?" she asked. "Yes," Dante said quietly. "You showed me what I was, so I could become something better." She nodded slowly. "Then you have learned well." Don Salvatore cleared his throat. "You are not yet ready to return fully, but you will be given responsibilities, small ones. You will prove yourself again, not to us, to yourself." Dante felt tears slip down his face. "Thank you," he whispered. Donna Bianca rose from her seat and walked around the table. She placed one hand on his shoulder, her touch light, almost fragile. "You are my grandson," she said softly, "and I am proud of the man you are becoming." She leaned down and kissed his forehead, a gesture she had never given him before. "Welcome home, Dante." And for the first time in 2 years, Dante Marconi allowed himself to believe that he was, at last, where he belonged.